Good morning. I'm Frank Kaufmann, president of the Settlement Project. We are greatly honored to have with us this morning Mr. Bill Gertz. Bill Gertz is an internationally recognized national security journalist, currently national security correspondent for the Washington Times. Mr. Gertz is the author of 8 books, 4 of which were New York Times bestsellers. His most recent book is Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. His 2016 book, entitled War and Peace in the Information Age, highlights 21st century threats posed by information warfare and cyber attacks. Mr. Gertz wrote Betrayal: How the Clinton Administration Undermined American Security. That too is on the New York Times bestseller list for several weeks. His second book, The China Threat: How the People's Republic Targets America, was released in November 2000, and the one following that, entitled Breakdown: How America's Intelligence Failures Led to September 11th, also became a national bestseller. It is a great pleasure to have Mr. Gertz with us here on the program this morning. Bill Gertz, thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's fantastic to have you with us.
Sure, it's great to be here.
And Bill, you go by Bill, right? I don't call you William Gertz or Mr. Gertz or Bill Gertz. Is very good. Okay, appreciate that. Thanks a lot for making time. Because of your level of expertise, I know you're under constant demand, and you've made time for us, which is our good luck. What I wanted to do with us is, I know that like every second is precious and China's the point, but I wanted to give a little chance for our listeners to know about you as a professional and as a successful person in a high-profile field. And so if you don't mind, just for the youngsters or for anybody just kind of dreaming of being in the work of journalistic life or journalism of some stripe, I'd love to ask you just a couple of questions personally. Did you know this from a young age? Did you always have a bent in that way? Or when did you first kind of sense that this might be a path for you?
Well, I guess it was probably when I worked for an organization called the Freedom Leadership Foundation, which was working with dissidents in the Soviet Union and really focused on anti-communism and pro-freedom publication. And we published a small little newspaper called The Rising Tide. Meaning the rising tide of freedom, and that was in the late 1970s. So that was kind of my beginning point. I then joined the New York City Tribune in the early 80s, and during that period of time, I covered one of the last of the Watergate trials. It was 2 senior FBI officials who were persecuted for conducting covert break-ins as part of their mission to conduct intelligence and counterintelligence operations. And of course, that was the Watergate period, again, was a time of when journalism was at its height. The Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein brought down a president, and I realized that it had an appeal for me to be able to play a significant role, have an impact by doing news reporting, and that's kind of how I got into the business.
I see. So it wasn't like you didn't go to college and study journalism. It was more being caught up in a passion of content rather than kind of a sense of a career. It was the issues you were covering really that drew you into the work, it sounds like.
Well, I studied journalism at George Washington University, but again in Washington. But my career has been around I'm kind of a cold warrior, so that kind of has shaped my views and my outlook, and that's kind of,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. And then again, sticking to this little patch in our conversation here, just about the craft. You have risen to an enormously high status of influence in your field, and I was wondering if you have any kind of advice in terms for aspiring journalists, in terms of like what are the rules, what it's not so much like how to write, but what type of person does one have to be trusted with sources, to be not compromised in whatever temptation. Every field has its temptations. How do you stay on track, and how do you rise and become somebody apart from good luck and God's grace? But do you have some kind of rules for what it means to do this job properly and with integrity, or this kind of question that might be good advice for an aspiring young writer?
Well, first off, I would make the point that the news business is really facing a time of difficulty, and I think that this is we're really people are news organizations which once were driven by massive profits from the sale of display advertising in print editions. It's all gone away, and the new model is everything is shifting from print newspapers to online digital publishing. And again, broadcast journalism is a little bit different, but they have also been affected by the rise of cable news and the explosion of news outlets online. So people are really searching for the model that can sustain good journalism, and it's a problem. The second thing that has happened is the politicization of news. If you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post today, they're not the same as they were even 10 or 15 years ago when they were presenting both sides in an unbalanced way, usually balanced toward the liberal viewpoint. But we're now at the point where the news business is become very highly charged politically, and I think that that's a real problem that needs to be solved. People need to be able to debate. I think that debate is the most important tool for presenting news, presenting balance, presenting both sides. I think those are key things I would look at in the news business. The other, from a news reporting standpoint, I guess in the news industry, the types of people that are in the news business, they generally fall down on two sides: writers and reporters, and editors. And you'll see that editors are generally directing reporters, directing coverage, making decisions about what to cover and how to cover it, down to the tactical level of editing copy and how to present things. Whereas on the writing side and the reporting side, it's really digging and trying to find stories, news stories. News is fairly ill-defined, but it's generally anything that we think people want to know or things that we think they should know. So it's both informational and educational.
Very good. Two more questions on this, and then I really want to get to your book and China itself. At some point, you hit a juncture in your career in which it's clear that in a certain way you've become somebody who's sought after, somebody, if there's anybody inside, say, government or company, that they want to get to you, they want to get the information to you in particular. And at this point, is there something that changes in life? Do you have to recalibrate your moral direction, or do you never really know that? It only becomes evident to others that in a way it's kind of you're famous, or you're somebody, or you're an expert now. Is there something that happens in life that makes me realize, oh, now life is serious, or now something's changed? Did that happen to you?
Not really. I still consider myself a newsman, news reporter, somebody looking for a good story. I'm probably kind of on the tail end of my career now, but I think that we talk about the news business, especially on the reporting side. We have a saying that you're only as good as your sources, and so it requires the ability to develop sources of information. And I've just been very lucky in my career to have really good sources. I remember former CIA Director Jim Woolsey saying one time, he said, Bill used to drive me crazy because I couldn't figure out where the leaks were coming from. But now that I'm out of the CIA, I read his stuff to find out what's going on. So that's kind of the way it goes. But I try to get information, and I try to develop sources who can provide me with the information. It's become very, very difficult in recent years, specifically in the aftermath of two major, what they call insider cases inside the U.S. government. The first was the case of Sergeant Manning, the Army intelligence person that was in Iraq and leaked massive amounts of classified information. That was followed by the Edward Snowden case, which was even more damaging. And as a result of that, the government has really sought to tighten up what they call the insider threat. And part of that effort has been to protect their information, but one of the negative effects of that is that they regard the press as the enemy, as an enemy force to be dealt with as an enemy, where in the past, many places in government or other institutions, they looked at the press as kind of a force multiplier. In other words, you could get positive stories out about whatever it was that you wanted to express. So that's kind of where things are today.
Got it. Interesting. Almost a fundamental shift, what you're describing. The last thing is, you've written a lot of books. Is there a time in life where suddenly you realize my articles or my news reporting, I have more to say than that? Did you have to develop a new power or new skill or new discipline, or is it almost the same, just writing more, or how's that changed like?
I would say that it's as part of the shift in the overall news business. The print side of the news business, which is now really the digital side, but it's still print. That has been the driving force for the news business. Even before the advent of the internet, it was always that the print reporters were the foundation for what was broadcast or what was spread. But I think that now, with the explosion of news outlets and the how things are being spread online, the rise of fake news and false information and conspiracy theories, it's created new problems. And I think we're seeing debates now as the Democrats are in power now. They're actually talking about stifling free speech and the free press.
Yeah.
So we're in a perilous period where cancel culture is a real danger. I think that one of the biggest examples was the New York Times, when they published an opinion article by Senator Tom Cotton, which said that the U.S. should call out troops to put down the riots that were taking place last summer throughout the cities in America. And this created such a huge backlash within the New York Times staff that they said that this threatened their reporters. Now, if a reporter feels threatened, by a op-ed piece, they shouldn't be in the news business. I mean, this is the snowflake culture that's really going to be destructive of our whole society overall. So those are the kinds of things that we're dealing with today. But basically, my view is I look for stories that no one else has, and that's getting much more difficult to do. And the strategy for writing stories is if you can break big stories. For example, today I published a report in the Washington Times which revealed, no one else has reported on it, that China has revived decades-old disinformation claiming that the United States military during the Korean War used biological weapons. The backdrop for this is new questions are being raised amid the pandemic about what kinds of covert biological warfare research was being carried out at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is one of the two main possible theoretical origins of the coronavirus outbreak.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That's an important article. Good. That brings us right to the edge of the main reason why we're together. That's to discuss China, and more particularly, I mean, you've written tons on China, but I've prepared from your book called Deceiving the Sky. And a couple of little front end questions on that. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, exactly where it's at now? Its original publication is coming out again. Is it a revised? Can you tell us a little bit about the history of this particular piece of writing, the book?
Deceiving the Sky is my 8th book, and it was published in the fall of 2019. And basically, it did very well, and it's very popular. It's an extremely good primer on the subject of the what I call the China threat. That is and this is actually the second China book that I wrote. The first one came out in 2000 and was called The China Threat. And that title, way back 21 years ago, was a play on what Beijing calls the China threat theory. And China the Communist Party of China has tasked its diplomats, intelligence personnel, business people all around the world to monitor the level of opposition to China. And they call that the China threat, China threat theory. And they try to measure how that effort hinders their development. And again, because they're on a rise, beyond rise, they literally have designs for global domination or Chinese Communist Party supremacy. So after I wrote that book, every publisher after that said they would not publish a single topic China book. And I was curious as to why. They never explained why. It may have been business reasons. They told me that you can have chapters on China, but they didn't want a full book on China. Well, beginning in 2019, I said, look, so much has happened since the China threat was published. It's imperative that I do an update, that I do a follow-up on the China threat. And so Deceiving the Sky, that's how I started that. And again, it came out at the end of 2019. Right
Very
now,
good.
At the end of March will be the publication of the paperback edition with a new preface that will be coming out. I think the publication date for that is March 30th.
Okay, so March 30th, the paper, and is that a typical time frame for publishers working their numbers? They'll have hardback for a period of time, and then okay, very good. And if you don't mind, how about the name itself? It's a great one.
Well,
thanks.
if I initially wanted to title the book "The New Evil Empire," because that's really what we're seeing in the case of China. It's very similar to the Soviet Communist Empire.
Right.
Only it's also very much different in a lot of different ways. But Deceiving the Sky
Right.
is based on ancient Chinese strategy, and it's basically going back. I think it's 300 BC was a period called the Warring States era. And it was during this period
Yes.
where there were warlords and factions, and the main issue was, again, fighting among many different feudal areas of China. And the story based on Deceiving the Sky, there are 32 Chinese strategies. You know, everyone's familiar with Sun Tzu, but this other book on the 32 Chinese strategies, the very first of which says, deceive the sky to cross the ocean. And it's based on a story, a fable, that an emperor was reluctant to go to war with a neighboring province. And one of his generals basically tricked the emperor into going to war. And he did that by inviting the emperor to dinner at a wealthy peasant's house. And when the emperor stepped on the wealthy peasant's house, he felt it move. It was a ship, and they were on their way, and the emperor had to decide whether to go to war or to go back. And he decided to go to war. And this is in the basis in Chinese culture, the sky or the emperor is considered God or the sky. So the idea behind this strategy is that you have to be willing to deceive God or deceive the emperor in order to achieve your ends. And I think this is very appropriate for what is happening today among the Communist Party of China, that they are using all means and especially deception in order to achieve their goal, which is ultimately creating a world in which China is the supreme power. The most important part of that is that China recognizes that in order to achieve that global dominance, that global supremacy, they have to defeat and ultimately destroy the United States. That is the main impediment to their achieving this status as the supreme power in the world.
Very right. I just want to say to the listeners here that Mr. Gertz is speaking in just plain, straight, broad strokes, but the book is very dense and very detailed in the defense and support of these kind of broad stroke positions that the book takes. If I may, I want to go through a few things that struck me as I read. One of the things which comes, it leaves me confused, that it seems to me that people who are in high positions of power, including intelligence and military, these are the positions where you're vetted 1,000 times over. You've got to be a patriot of the most impeccable order. You know, that it has clearances and the like, and yet as I read that there seems to be, even at the very highest levels of people who are meant to be caring for our country, protecting our country, anticipating threats to our country, that it's kind of riven with people who are just plain either fooled or deceived or they don't see any of the things you're pointing out, and they seem so plain and evident. I should have written down a couple of the names of the people you describe. You describe someone of very high diplomatic representation telling you, oh, China's not a threat or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
Can you account to me how that happens or what that is?
I tell this story, and this was actually which inspired me to begin writing about the Communist Party of China and its activities and operations. And it goes back to my first book, which was The China Threat. And at the time, I was a young Washington Times reporter, and I went to the Pentagon and got a briefing on the Chinese military, which back then, again, the press wasn't viewed as the enemy, and they were very helpful in providing background briefings like that. It wasn't revelatory. There wasn't a lot of details, but it was was an important thing. At the end of the briefing on the Chinese military, a colonel came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And the general, turns out, was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the top military intelligence official in government. And we sat down in a conference room, in a windowless room in the Pentagon, and he began to tell me, "Bill, China's not a threat." And using my reporter's inquisitiveness, I asked him why he thought that. And his response to me was basically, because they say they're not a threat. Now, this really shocked me because I could expect that from civilian intelligence analysts and especially policy analysts who are constantly misinterpreting China. But to hear the top military official tell you that a country that is a communist state, that has a communist system, that has nuclear weapons, and yet was not a threat, was really amazing to me. And to me, it showed that China's ability to deceive the West had achieved a massive success in fooling the top officials and intelligence. Now, I could argue that the general was merely trying to spin me in order to fit some policy, but it was very dishonest of him to say that. And I've seen that theme, this idea that China is not a threat. It began way back in the 70s when Richard Nixon did his big opening to China, and we played the China card. But then after the Soviet Union fell, the pro-China policy went on autopilot. It was never revised. And so we had this decades-long thing, to the point where during the George W. Bush administration, the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, went so far as to say not only was China not a threat, but that the United States preferred a strong China. And of course, this was never enunciated why we wanted this, other than that we wanted to trade with them. But it's part of a narrative that has been developed by several elements of the U.S. government and the private sector. For example, the business community, they were the ones that drooled at the idea of a 1.4 billion market of consumers who could buy products and things. From the policy side, we had the leftover Nixon-era policy of China's a quasi-ally, and therefore we have to do it. The foreign policy elites also argued that, well, the power of trade and capitalism was so strong that if we just traded with China, that this would have a moderating influence, and that we saw China pretending to be a quasi-capitalist state, that this would have a moderating effect and ultimately transform this communist system into a non-threatening capitalist system. Well, to me, that was the biggest failure of the past 40 years. I call it the engagement gambit, the idea that if we just engaged in trade with China, that it would change them. Instead, what has happened is China was built up with the theft of American technology, with business people that did business invested in unfair trade practices. For example, when businesses would go into China, they would be required to turn over valuable intellectual property that the Chinese would then steal and use for their benefit, and to the negative effect of American and Western companies. So this is kind of the situation where we are today. We've created this monster that is now on the march and poses what I consider the most serious threat to freedom and democracy and our basic way of life that we have seen since the World War II period.
Yeah. Now, is it possible for you to kind of spin out a rough like numbers or percentages? Are the people, like, you speak of people like Pompeo and who's it?
Yes.
Miles Yu? Yeah. Now, these people from what I understand, they get it. They're clear. Are they in the vast majority? Is it a steep uphill battle, or is it 50-50? Or in terms of I'm not talking about Democrat, Republican. We kind of know where that goes, but just inside a family of sincere American patriots that care for the country, and then there's this, like, I mean, you mentioned like icons of the right, like Condoleezza Rice, who sounds like kind of gets it wrong a little bit. Are the getting it wrong ones in the high percentage, or what are we talking about? Are you like a tiny little rebel force? I hope you get my question. This fraternity of people that get it, is it tiny? Is it 50-50? Or what are
I
we
think
looking
that
at
in the
on that?
last 4 years, during the Trump administration, we've seen a major shift away from the unfettered engagement policy towards China, toward a recognition that we have, Houston, we have a problem, that this is a very serious threat to our way of life and our society. Um, that said, the bureaucracy within government and the pro-China elements in the business community and other sectors of society have not changed. There are a lot. I would say that it's a, a percentage, probably, if I were to put a figure on it, that 25% that get it, 50% that are thinking
Mm,
about it, and then 50% that want to go back to the old ways. And um,
mm,
yeah, and I think the biggest misunderstanding about China today, and this is still pervasive, is this notion that China is not really a communist state. And I remember doing
mm,
a debate by a group called Intelligence Squared in New York City. I was on a panel with Mike Pillsbury and Walter Mearsheimer. And then on the other side was the pro-China people were Stapleton Roy, who was a protege of Henry Kissinger, and then a businessman
mm,
whose name was Richard McGregor. And he told me afterwards, he said he's been doing business in China for 20 years and he's never met a communist. And to me, this was simply astounding. And I told him, I said, well, you should, next time you're in China, you should visit the People's Liberation Army Museum, which I was able to do back in the late 90s during an official visit there with Secretary of Defense. And inside the PLA Museum, they have statues of all the early communist founders, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. Even Stalin was still in there. So and yet this understanding of Chinese communist ideology has been totally misunderstood. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, they don't really believe in it; they're just going through the motions." That's absolutely not the case, and it's become much more evident under the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, who has really kind of become kind of the
mm-hmm,
new Mao Zedong of China, the absolute dictator, going back to the old communist ways. And so that's really the problem.
mm-hmm,
And I learned this especially from, as you mentioned, Miles Yu. He worked on the policy planning staff for Secretary of State Pompeo, and he, better than anyone, and I quoted him in my book as really educating people to the ideological threat of Chinese communists.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, the as I read, and I'm trying to solve my confusion. It's again, I've described it already, that I couldn't understand why people don't get it, why they persist in certain kind of uh, fallacious fallacies and nicisms, and it's not communist. And one of the things that struck me is that it's almost as though one needs to start with principles rather than with anecdotal. It seems like all the experts are experts on, well, I met a Chinese person once, or like this gentleman says, I've been doing business in China for. If you start with no principles, you don't have any prism or lenses through which to see clearly. Would you say, is that part of how this kind of billowing smoke of, well, they're all right and they're they're changing, or it's what I call taxi cab anecdotalism expertise or something like that. I took a cab from the airport and now I'm an expert on New
I
York,
think
that
it's
kind
more
of thing.
ideological from the American perspective. I think that it's and it's really something that I think no think tank or no academic has really looked at. This question of why the United States and people in the United States have so misunderstood the Communist Party of China. I think part of it is the war of narratives. One is the so-called, what I call the anti-communist view. That's a view that is kind of a leftover from the 50s and the McCarthy period, where anybody who expresses opposition to communism is considered worse than a communist, and I'm not exaggerating. Then there's another sector, which I call the New Left, which arose during the 1960s in the anti-war period. And after they were beaten in the streets in Chicago in 1968, they carried out what they called the Long March through the Institutions of America. And a lot of these New Left radicals really looked at China as the model of future communism, whereas the Soviet Union was looked at as bad communism. China was viewed as good communism. And I think that has really become a very underlying narrative in a lot of people's political outlooks.
Very interesting. That's very helpful. That's helpful. Thanks. We're getting short on time. There's far more things I had planned than there's time for. I'll just pick two, if I may, and I'll just give them up front. You can work your way through them as you like. As I read, I was surprised to find who I thought were the less patriotic or rose to greater sensitivity to the China threat. And so in your description, elements in the CIA were very weak and very vulnerable and very susceptible to being infiltrated and misled by Chinese designs. Whereas you described the FBI as, I was quite surprised. You said there's 2,000 special agents to the on Chinese counterintelligence and 5,000 current FBI counterintelligence cases. And then Christopher Wray was at the head of this. And typically for conservatives or pro-Trump conservatives, Wray has been a suspicious character, and the FBI has been kind of a denigrated institution. And yet, between the two intelligence agencies, FBI, CIA, it looks like from your writing and research that the CIA was the one that was weak and the FBI was strong. It was a curiosity to me that if that's of interest for you to talk about. And then the last question I'll put up front so that you can close on whatever you think is best for us to know. We are entering into a period of totalitarian censorship, book burning, the forbidding of dissent, the manipulation of digital content to prevent dissenting voices. It's a very threatening time. Presently in the United States, they've exploited the narrative of insurrection to kind of to define all conservative opinion as the threat of violence or incitation of violence simply for having a classical kind of Christian view of the world is suddenly the incitation of violence. So that ties for me to the Chinese issues regarding where do I have it here? The National Public Credit Information Center you describe, and I forget the term where I had it. It's social credit system, and I feel like that's being threatened here as well. So these were with kind of flipping of the agencies, in which I thought one was better. The opposite one was better and worse. Ray came out not a bad guy in this. That surprised me. And then on the other thing, just in general, if you can speak to the precipice that we're standing on in terms of how close it's coming in the U.S. to these kinds of horrific realities of the social credit system that is
first on the
people
FBI. You have to look at it in the context of the Trump administration. They set very early on, and there's a remarkable National Security Council document that was declassified probably maybe January of this year. And in that, they laid out what they wanted to do with dealing with China. And they were successful in a number of major areas, and I would call them pockets of excellence. The key pockets of excellence, as you mentioned, were the State Department under Mike Pompeo, who really got it better than any Secretary of State in recent memory. The second area that was a pocket of excellence was the Justice Department, of which the FBI is a part of. Now, the FBI was negatively politicized under the Obama administration to the point where we saw what kind of counterintelligence people they had in Peter Strzok. It was a joke that this guy was the most senior counterintelligence official and had been totally politicized and completely unprofessional, as the documents in that matter showed. But at the Justice Department, they formed something called the China Initiative. And it was this China Initiative that was one of the most active and successful policy changes. By the way, the China Initiative, as far as I can tell, has not been given up by the Biden administration. And they're continuing on almost a monthly, sometimes on a bi-weekly basis, of prosecutions of China-related espionage. And that's where this figure of the 2,000 agents and the 5,000 investigations come in. So the FBI is basically saluting and following the directive of the Justice Department, as it should be. And it was the Justice Department that was really driving the train on what the kinds of activities. Now, it was Pompeo and Miles Yu who launched, said we need to enunciate the U.S. Trump administration policy towards China. And they did that through a series of speeches, many of which I took part in. One was I flew to Phoenix, where National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien gave a major speech on the China threat. Christopher Wray also gave a major speech. Again, these speeches don't sound like big deals, but in order to get these speeches out, they had to release a lot of classified information on Chinese intelligence activities and the like. And so that's where that is.
I see.
On the second part, I would say that, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are living in perilous times as it stands for press freedom. And I agree in some sense that it's very difficult to try and educate and alert people in the United States to the threat posed by China when our own system is under threat from the radical left in the United States. And that is clearly a new threat. That said, if we have any foreign policy priority, it has to be that it's going to take all of the United States' efforts to deal with the threat posed by China. And I mean that across the board. I don't think we should be focusing on the Middle East. I don't think we should be focusing on these other places. It's going to require a 100% effort to deal with the China threat. And that, I think, is the most important message of my book, Deceiving the Sky, that we really have to take on this challenge.
Thank you very much. Bill, I know that you're rushing from interview to interview. You have one in just a few minutes. And so I'll just wrap up by thanking you again for your time and your clarity, and wishing you continued health and strength to
thank
keep
you very much.
Getting the word out.
Okay.
Thanks. We'll talk
Bye.
again.